Here we have some very early products from KEF, from the turn of the 60s, from the very beginning of KEF's inception, moving through to some custom built speakers. The Celeste, which uses the very first incarnation of the B139 polystyrene bass unit and a Melinex HF unit. These here, the Crestas, which were manufactured in 1967, probably one of the very first compact loudspeakers in stereo pairs. A very early version of the B110 bass unit, which has been manufactured from the mid-60s all the way through to the mid-90s. Moving on, some LS5 1As. These were built. The cabinets were built by a company in Canada called Smythe, but all the working components, the acoustic side of the speakers, were built by KEF as a supplied back. We have the very first Coda. As you can see, it's a very compact loudspeaker, again introduced in the very late 60s, early 70s. They're moving through to some more brand names that you probably recognise from KEF, the Chorale, the KEF Kit, and also the Concerto, which is a very famous loudspeaker. This one featured the B139, the 110, and the T27 tweeter.
Brings good memories.
The B139. As you can see, it's a racetrack design, which enabled us at the time to get the boxes much narrower, as opposed to using a big round drive unit, which this will perform as well as a good 10 or 12 inch bass unit. 5As that have been built have all been under license by the BBC. Not all necessarily built by KEF, but all of the drive units, tweeters and crossovers were built by KEF. In the early 70s, we introduced computers to the design of loudspeakers, and in 1973 we introduced the very first reference series model of loudspeakers. This is here is the reference model 104. This here in 1977 we introduced what we call pod technology, where we separated the mid-range and the mid-range and the HF section of the loudspeaker from the main bass cabinet itself. Here you'll see we have a B300 bass unit, very big, very powerful bass unit, operating in its own enclosure and chamber, which was decoupled from the mid-range and the HF section. This is the Coda 2. This was a very inexpensive, more budget end of the loudspeaker range. These were very popular. We sold lots and lots of these throughout the early 80s. Between the mid-80s and late 80s, we introduced the very first version of the UniQ technology. This is the very first product to feature UniQ. This is the C35. In 1989, this is actually the year I joined KEF. This is the first product that I actually built, was the 1053, and this was the first reference speaker to feature UniQ technology. And again, separating the mid-range and the HF sections of the speaker from the main bass enclosure. This is the 107, and again, looking back at the design SKUs from the 105 back in the 70s, separating the bass enclosure from the mid and HF. This still was a very strong speaker, and this was the flagship of our range all the way through the 90s. Area of our business where Gold Peak were involved. So in the turn 92, 93, and the injection of resource that they gave to us, or invested into us, enabled us to then start to range our products. As before, one of the first ranges that we were able to introduce under the GP banner was the Q series range. This here is the Q50. And we also introduced centre speakers. Obviously, it was a growing market for ProLogic in the days in the early to mid 90s, and we were the very first British loudspeaker manufacturer to introduce a centre speaker under $300 into the US market. As you can see here, is the Coda 7. This is one of the biggest success stories of the 90s from KEF. This was introduced in 1994, and it sounded absolutely amazing. It's won awards all over. As we move further on, obviously theatre is now is growing in strength, and certainly through the mid to late 90s, it was picking up a pace really quickly. We introduced satellite speakers. This is the Model 60S with dedicated subwoofers, so subset packages are now starting to happen at this area of our business. This here is the Maidstone. This was a one-off project specifically designed for the Japanese market. One of the very first manufacturers in the UK to introduce curved cabinets at this price point into any market anywhere in the world. And it's been a very strong line for us. And it wasn't until 2010 that we then went back to rectilinear, purely down to suiting trends. Gold Peak, as you know, at the helm of our business, they offered a world of resource to us, and we're very grateful for that. What it's enabled us to do is introduce new materials to our loudspeaker design and loudspeaker build. introducing materials like aluminium, which generally it's enabled us to come up with things like this, which would generally, before the interjection of Gold Peak, be very much unheard of. This is the KIF 100 speaker, where it has the UniQ at the front and has a flat panel technology loudspeaker at the rear, which obviously emits in both directions to give us very realistic rear effects from something that's in front of you, which is absolutely incredible.